Welcome back, everybody. Well, today we're going to talk about the Department of Justice and their lawsuit against Visa for, quote, monopolizing debit markets. And I had more than a few of you guys ask me about this. Usually when I see these DOJ lawsuits, I just kind of ignore them because I don't really worry about them until they get resolved and there's something to actually worry about. But in this case, because I'm very familiar with the payments industry, and that was kind of what I did in my corporate job, it was an opportunity for me to dig in and see what is actually in here and to give you my thoughts on it. So what I did was go through the full 70-page document and just kind of highlighted areas that I thought were interesting that we'll talk about. And so I'm doing this really with no notes, just my highlights in the document and just my general kind of ideas and thoughts off the top. So it's not going to be as polished as most videos. I'm probably going to get pretty irritated in this video just because some of the things that I see in here just kind of go against my personal view of how I think kind of markets and capitalism and all that should work. And just for clarification, just in case any of you guys care about this type of stuff, I'm not really political at all. If you've watched any of my previous videos, I'm very apolitical, meaning that I don't really like or trust politicians on either side of this. I think the political landscape in America is terrible in terms of just really smart, competent people helping move the country forward. I think we have a lot of kind of posturing on both sides and nonsense. And one of the things I love about stocks and markets and business is that it's more of a meritocracy than we see in other places. It's, hey, build a great product, do something that really helps people and has a lot of value, and hopefully you see success. And I think what we're going to see in this video is that a lot of the ideas or issues that they present to me are more about, hey, this is kind of how business works. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think too. So let's dive into it. So first off, there's a lot of like introductory things, and we'll kind of get to all the ideas here as we go. But the very first highlighted passage that I have here says, as a result, debit networks face what Visa calls a chicken and egg problem. To be successful, the network needs many issuers and acquirers to accept the network, but issuers are unlikely to join the debit network unless many merchants already use the network. And merchants are unlikely to join the network unless their customers have cards that work with the network, which requires the issuer to have activated the network. As Visa itself observes, building scale on both sides, with consumers, payers, and with merchants and payees, is a Herculean task. Visa further recognizes that these efforts create, quote, an enormous moat around its business. And the first thing that I will say to that is, well, yeah. That's the great thing about Visa as a stock and as a company. They've created this enormous economic moat because they have issuers, they have merchants, and they have a product in between them that works really great. So yes, I agree, of course. But then if we go down, they say, Visa's market shares demonstrate just how deep that moat is. Visa's been the largest debit network in the United States for decades. Today, over 60% of all U.S. debit transactions run via Visa's payments network, and Visa's share of card-not-present debit exceeds 65%. MasterCard is a distant second, processing less than 25% of all U.S. debit transactions and card-not-present U.S. debit transactions. Other networks, known as PIN networks, because they originally facilitated ATM transactions for which account holders needed to enter a PIN, are significantly smaller. So there's a bunch of these networks that allow you to kind of do these PIN transactions, but over the years have kind of upgraded to be able to do transactions without a PIN as well. And they're really the core of the discussion around competition with the debit networks. But then if we continue on, they say this moat is no accident. Coming out of the Great Recession, Visa identified two significant threats to its monopoly, one from legislation and one from emerging technology. Visa took steps to counter both, enriching itself handsomely in the process. So what I call that is basically good business strategy, right? I mean, they identified two threats to their business and they took steps to be able to make sure that they didn't impact their moat or impact their business. That's what you want from people who are running a business. The vision and the foresight to see what's coming, adjust however they need to adjust to continue being successful with a product that has extreme value, which I think what we'll see is definitely the case. All right, so if we come down here, one of the things that they say is there are a substantial number of debit transactions that Visa owns outright without facing any competition. Such transactions are non-contestable by rival networks. And this idea of non-contestable transactions versus contestable transactions is one that comes up a lot in this document. And the easiest way to explain it is Visa has agreements in place to where there are certain transactions that can only go over the Visa network, right? So if they have an issuer is like a bank, right, who issues your debit card. If that bank has Visa on the front of the card, which many of them do, or the majority of them do, and they don't actually enable the backup network on the back of the card, then kind of by default, that has to go through Visa's network. And there's a combination of if the issuer only allows Visa and then the merchant and the acquirer only allow Visa, then basically the transaction has to go over Visa's network. But whenever you have a situation where that's not the case, those are the contestable transactions, which can kind of go over any network. And so as we see, if we keep scrolling down, what they say is that Visa offers a modern-day Hobson's choice. Visa leverages its control over non-contestable transactions and extracts routing deals that limit competition for contestable transactions. Absent a routing agreement, the merchant or acquirer pays a list price, known in the industry as a rack rate, on any transaction that is routed to Visa's debit network. Alternatively, the merchant or acquirer signs an agreement with Visa and receives a so-called discount on all transactions, both non-contestable and contestable. And they basically go on to say other debit networks cannot compete for non-contestable transactions, as they often struggle to compete for any meaningful share of transactions involving a merchant subject to a Visa routing deal. And merchants suffer if they do not accept Visa's agreement. So there's a lot to kind of digest there, but the part that I think is really important is it says, okay, Visa is basically taking their position as this market leader who has, agreements with issuers and with merchants. And so this combination of transactions where you say, let's say half of them are non-contestable. They have to go through Visa's network because of decisions that issuers and merchants made. And in some cases, it's because of the agreements that they've made with Visa. But regardless, those transactions are non-contestable. So what Visa is doing to get all of the transactions is they go to the merchant and they say, look, you're already doing this percentage of transactions via non-contestable transactions that you have to send to me through my network. And here's a percentage of transactions that are contestable that you can send to other people. Well, the list rate for using my network is X, but if you do all your transactions through me, I'll give you X minus 50% or whatever the thing is, and that basically makes the non-contestable transactions virtually free. And now they do say here that merchants suffer if they don't accept Visa's agreement. That's something that I want to talk about a little bit later because I question what that actually means or how they quantify that. So the other thing they talk about here is FinTech companies, and we'll talk about this in more detail a little bit later, but they basically say that Visa knew that several digital platforms, including Apple, PayPal, and Square, have large existing networks that connect merchants and consumers and offer payment products to consumers. And basically, they have here that Visa feared these digital platforms may have network ambitions and might seek to eliminate Visa and other debit networks as links between consumers and merchants for debit transactions. Visa saw Apple Pay, for example, as an existential threat to its debit business. Recognizing the threat they posed, Visa's strategy has been to partner with emerging players before they become disruptors. To do so, Visa structures its deals with potential competitors to dissuade them from competing. Visa offers lucrative incentives, sometimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually, to these potential competitors under the express condition that they do not develop competing product or compete in ways that could threaten Visa's dominance. In addition to the carrot of these incentives, Visa has also threatened to use the stick of additional fees to dissuade their potential competitors' innovation if they develop competing products. Now, again, that's a lot of words. And when you read them like that, like the verbiage they use, it sounds like overly negative. But I think what we're going to see is that it's not quite this straightforward, right? So when they say stuff like, recognizing the threat they pose, Visa's strategy has been to partner with emerging players before they become disruptors. So they frame it as, Visa's just partnering with them, out of the good of their heart to prevent them from innovating. But I think what you'll find when you look at the examples that they give around PayPal, around Cash App, that those platforms needed Visa just as much as anything else, right? In order to get users and actually have a business or have a product that worked and added value. And so when they say things like Visa offers lucrative incentives, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, to potential competitors under the express condition that they do not develop a competing product or compete in ways that can threaten Visa's dominance. I mean, again, words matter, right? So you can frame it this way and say, oh, they're just paying them so that they don't innovate and they don't disrupt Visa. Well, no, they're paying them for features and capabilities that allows them to reach customers, and Visa allows them to do that, right? And so what Visa is doing in their agreements is saying, look, we'll partner with you on this feature that you want to use because you want to reach these customers. You want to use our network. Cool. But the caveat to that is, hey, you can't go create some competing thing while you're in business with us using our network. That's not cool. Or if you're going to do that, fine, then that means we need to renegotiate our deal because the impact to us is greater than if you don't do that. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff, right? In business, it's, look, man, you want to reach these customers, you want to use our network, cool, let's partner, no problem, here's the terms. But if you're going to go this other way with it and try to cut us out, then yeah, you're going to pay a little bit more for those transactions that you use with us, or it's going to be in breach of our contract. So, it acts like there's no other choice, right? At the end of the day, PayPal doesn't have to use Visa rails. They could not offer that, right? If they want to just do the stuff that they can completely control. So I think we'll see that in the examples to come, but it's a lot of this type of stuff where it's framing it as, well, nobody has a choice other than to work with Visa. And Visa is creating these contracts that have these words in it that basically say, hey, we'll partner with you, but if you do this other thing, we're going to raise prices. Okay. Honestly, that is way more normal than not normal in terms of agreements that you have with people that you're partnering with. Because at the end of the day, you're both doing a business deal, right? It's not like Visa's over there like, hey, you have to sign this contract with me. PayPal and these other people are saying, look, I need this feature in order to get users. People want to use their Visa card, or I want to be able to send a person-to-person payment over the Visa network. And Visa's saying, cool, let's do that. Here's the terms. But if you go this other way with it, we're going to raise prices on you. Sorry. Okay, so as they continue on, they say, today, the non-Visa MasterCard-owned networks collectively represent only 11% of all debit transactions and only 5% of card-not-present debit transactions. And the only thing that stood out to me here is, now MasterCard is included in the calculation and not just Visa. Is MasterCard in the lawsuit? Why are we doing that, right? Because I think MasterCard's like, 25%? So, now if you say Visa's like 70%, like, yeah, that's still a lot. It's an overwhelming majority, but it's not 100, it's not 90, it's not even, 80. So I think this is, again, a way to kind of mislead and say, oh, it's Visa and MasterCard when this lawsuit's supposed to be about Visa. And then next up, third, Visa has already secured commitments from several large would-be competitors that they would not unveil products that could threaten Visa's dominance, rather than engage in fulsome competition. Visa's agreements with these companies, including Apple, PayPal, and Square, have succeeded in transforming those potential competitors into partners to the detriment of competition from those would-be rivals and Visa's own incentives to innovate at the expense of the American consumer and American merchants of all sizes. And I think this is a really interesting may be the wrong word, but at the end of the day, here's what you have to think about, right? Each of these businesses are making a business decision, right? So let's take Apple. Apple's a good one because it actually talks about in here how Visa viewed Apple as a huge threat, which makes perfect sense because people love Apple. They actually have control over the ecosystem. Apple Pay without a card is still a very viable thing. I mean, Apple Cash exists today, and that definitely could take some, traction or some volume away from debit. I think that's a real threat for Visa. But at the end of the day, if Apple decides that, partnering with Visa and getting a discount on Visa cards is really the more, attractive business opportunity, then they're going to do that. It's not about, oh, you're stifling innovation. They're making a business decision. And they're saying, look, yeah, we want to get Apple Pay off the ground. Not everybody wants to view us as a bank because we're a big tech company. So let's partner with Visa. Let's make sure all Visa cards are in there. And of course, MasterCard and all those worked as well. But that's not anti-competitive. That's Apple making a business decision to say, 70% of the people out there are using Visa cards. Those need to be in Apple Pay and they need to work. And that needs to be a big part of how we roll out because all this stuff happens in stages, right? So a lot of the things that they're talking about here, like 2013 and things happened a decade ago, Well, it's changed pretty dramatically since then. So, I don't know that just because they get into a contractual relationship with a competitor doesn't necessarily mean that they're stifling innovation. It could mean that that competitor really is making a business decision to say, look, it's more attractive for us and our customers to partner with Visa than it is to try to create a whole new payment system that doesn't exist, that no one is asking for. And then the last part here of the introduction, it says Visa's actions deny Americans the benefits of competitive markets for debit transactions. Visa, one of the most profitable companies in the U.S., has succeeded so thoroughly in insulating itself from competition that is now earning outsized profit margins from its role as a dominant intermediary, a digital middleman at the center of the debit transaction market. American merchants, large and small, ultimately pay much of these fees. In turn, they may raise prices to consumers or may absorb the cost by offering fewer products or lower quality. Now, here's where I kind of have a little bit of an issue, right? When we use terms like they're earning outsized profit margins, what does outsized profit margins mean? What is the correct acceptable amount of profit margin? Have we decided that? Is government deciding that now of how much profit you can make? And when we say things like they're a digital middleman, it's minimizing what they've created, right? Like, let's be real here. What Visa and MasterCard have created, and I feel very strongly about this because when I look at, how payments work today, right? The reason why all these fintechs and, PayPal and Square and all these people want to work with the card networks is because the card networks are one of the only networks that you can hit anybody in the world globally in any currency and do it in real time, right? And it works. And so merchants all across the globe have the capability now to get paid in any currency 24/7, 365, and have it just work. That is extremely valuable for a merchant because think about what existed before that. Well, you're getting paid in cash. Okay, cool. Cash is fine. But what about checks, right? You're getting paid via check. You're having to float basically the product to the person before you know that the money is good. Whereas when cards came about, all of a sudden you get verification of payment in real time or verification of funds, right? There's value in that. So I think just kind of washing this into, oh, you're just a digital middleman, like they're not providing value, is extremely dishonest and misleading. And I think the reason why they haven't been disrupted isn't because they're suppressing everyone. It's because creating something that is close to similar to what they've created to be able to really compete on actual value is very hard. And it would be so expensive for other people to do it. That's why they don't do it. That's why they're just partnering with them, because it's way cheaper for them to partner with Visa than it is to try to recreate what they've created. And I think that is something that is not addressed anywhere in this, and no one ever talks about it, but we act like, oh, this global network that they built is just this magic thing that doesn't cost anything and that everyone else can recreate. You want to compete? Great. Go recreate it. See how much it costs, how long it takes, and then let's talk about how much you want to charge per transaction for the investment that you make. All right, so a lot of what they do here is they go over kind of just what a debit transaction is. I'm not going to go over this, but we'll get here to the next part that I thought was interesting. And when they say Visa is the dominant front of card network, what they mean is basically the name on the front of your debit card, right? When your bank issues your debit card, what's the name on the front? It's usually Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, right? It says Visa is the dominant front of card network, MasterCard is a distant second front of card network, and two much smaller players account for the remainder. Issuers rarely change their front of card network due in part to significant switching costs, such as the cost of reissuing new debit cards to account holders. Visa has secured long-term contracts with many issuers. Visa knows that MasterCard and other debit networks have little opportunity to displace Visa as a front of card network for those banks. So in other words, what you're saying is they've built a very good brand, an amazing brand that has a ton of value that people don't want to switch from. And yes, of course, there are switching costs to be able to reissue every new debit card. But I worked at a bank that actually made the switch from MasterCard over to Visa, and they paid that switching cost because it was worth it from a value perspective, right? So again, it's not just that, oh, it costs so much to switch and that's why no one switches and that's why, Visa always has the monopoly. No, they have value. They're offering people value to where switching doesn't make business sense. And that's why they're the best brand in the business when it comes to front of card debit. And then they talk about how Visa branded debit cards also have a additional back of the card network that's not affiliated with Visa. And this was part of, I think, the Durbin Amendment, where you had to have kind of more than one so that it wasn't just routed through one carrier all the time. And so a lot of those are the PIN networks that we talked about before: Star, Nice, Pulse, Maestro, etc. And it says issuers decide whether to enable the back of card networks to process particular debit transactions on the issuer's debit cards. For example, issuers may not enable back of card networks for a card present transaction where a PIN was not entered. As discussed in Section 4 Infra, despite their presence on many debit cards, PIN networks have been unable to gain meaningful share of debit transactions, in part due to Visa's exclusionary and anti-competitive conduct. So the first thing I'll say there is it says in part. So it's not just Visa's conduct, but it's also that it's not quite as competitive, right? Like a bank can decide and say, look, for a card present transaction, if you're not entering a PIN, I'm not going to use the PIN network because I don't believe the authorization was good enough, right? So at the end of the day, that's the issuer's decision to make. Now, they may be influenced by Visa or by contract terms or by discounts or whatever that is, but that's still a business decision at the issuing bank. And specifically, when we talk about the Durbin Amendment, it says here, for the largest issuing banks with $10 billion or more in assets, the interchange fee amount is capped by the Federal Reserve. For smaller issuers, the debit network sets the amount of interchange fee. And this, I think, is a super important point because we're talking about this, debit monopoly, how much merchants are paying for interchange. And I think it's really important to actually get to the guts of what we're talking about. Like, how much are they actually paying? Because if you guys remember in my last video, I talked about how the Durbin Amendment back in 2010, 2011 had really capped interchange in the US. And this is important because it says for the largest issuing banks with 10 billion or more in assets, then that actually applies. And that's what the regulation did. And if we actually look at the interchange rates, this is actually from Visa's document right here, right? If we look at their debit interchange rates, we can see that they have two columns here. They have exempt and they have regulated. Now, regulated are ones that fall under the Durbin Amendment, which is basically any card that's issued from a bank with more than 10 billion in assets. And you're like, well, is that a lot? Is that a little? What does that mean? So I actually looked this up, and if we look at what banks are cut off at the 10 billion mark, what you see is it cuts off right here at Schwab, which is interesting. But the top 160 banks in the US are basically included in this. So I would imagine that is the bulk of the debit transactions out there. Obviously, if you're banking at a smaller kind of credit union or local bank, then they're probably below this threshold. But I would imagine, anything above Lakeland Bank, let's say, they're all covered under Durbin. And when we say they're capped at 21 cents plus 5 basis points on the transaction. So that means that the interchange can't be higher than 5 basis points plus 21 cents on any debit transaction when the card is issued from a bank that has greater than 10 billion in assets. Whew. That's a lot. But I think what's important here is to actually look at some data to see in practice what are merchants actually paying. So what I have here is a page from the Federal Reserve, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, where they're looking at the average debit card interchange fee by payment card network. And this is as of 2022 data. Now, there's a lot of information here, but I'm going to kind of go over just the basics of what they're showing. They show exempt transactions, which is what we said are from banks that are under 10 billion in assets. And then we have covered transactions, which is ones over 10 billion in assets. And then they have a group here that says all transactions, which is basically all of them together, exempt or not. And so I'm just going to focus on all transactions for right now. And you can see it's broken down here with Discover, MasterCard, and Visa kind of here at the top. Visa is broken down into two types because they have both dual message and single message. And then all those kind of PIN networks that are a single message network are kind of here at the bottom. And so the first thing that you see, if we just go all the way to the right here, interchange fee as a percent of average transaction value. So this is basically across all transactions, what is the average interchange fee that they're paying on those networks? You can see that Visa as a whole is at 0.76, which is actually lower than MasterCard and Discover by quite a bit, actually. And then if you go to the PIN networks, you can see that they do tend to be a little bit lower. They have Excel here at 56 basis points, and just in general, they're lower than the ones here at the top. So what does that actually mean? So number one, it does mean that those networks tend to be higher in terms of cost than these other PIN-only networks. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I think the answer is, well, it depends, right? Because the cost you're paying per transaction is simply one cost in the whole suite of things that you're doing in terms of a merchant or having a merchant acquiring business. And we're going to get into all that in more detail here, but my first question is, okay, if Visa is actually cheaper than even the other two major networks, then what are we even talking about in terms of competition, right? Like, yes, Visa is the dominant player, but couldn't part of the fact that they're the dominant player simply be that they're cheaper than MasterCard and Discover on average in terms of debit interchange? And you could say, well, that's because they're giving kickbacks to their issuers and their merchants in order to keep that volume. Great. Why would that be bad? It means that interchange is lower for those merchants, right, than it would be. And so I struggle a little bit to be like, how can you look at this data and then say that Visa is the entity that you need to attack, right? MasterCard and Discover are higher, and yeah, they're smaller in terms of, debit overall, but maybe that's part of why they're smaller. They're not as competitive in terms of rate. And you could say, well, but look at all these other ones down here, they're cheaper. But those other ones only do debit transactions, right? What Visa's offering is much broader than that, and that's part of what they talk about here coming up. And so down here they say that Congress passed the Durbin Amendment, and they're talking about how the Durbin Amendment also set maximum limits on the interchange fees that merchants and their banks pay regulated issuers, which we just talked about a little bit earlier, banks with more than $10 billion in assets. The interchange cap has a no evasion rule, which limits a network's ability to provide incentives to issuers by paying them more than the cap. These limits on incentives made it even more challenging for MasterCard or other networks to win front-of-card placement where Visa was the incumbent network because they often could not fully compensate the issuer for its switching cost. Now, this part of the document is where I almost threw something at my screen because this is what I don't like about these political things, right? Earlier on in the document and later on in the document, they talk about how Visa used their contractual kind of power and gave their, issuers and their merchants all these incentives in order to keep their power, or these, FinTech companies, all these incentives to keep their power. And then right here, they say that the Durbin Amendment, which was passed by lawmakers in the U.S. to basically reduce the profitability for Visa and MasterCard and other debit networks, that amendment put limits on incentives that made it even more challenging for MasterCard and other networks to win front-of-card placement. So they're saying on one hand that Visa using incentives to keep their, quote, monopoly power is bad, but that the fact that the Durbin Amendment was passed limited the ability for other networks to provide incentives to win that business. So are incentives bad or are they not bad? Because on one hand, you're saying that Visa's doing it and it's bad. And then on the other hand, you're saying, and this mandated law said that other people couldn't do the same thing. And this is what I don't like about this stuff. It's talking out of both sides of your mouth to try to make a point one way or another, but not making any sense, right? If incentives are bad, then it shouldn't matter that MasterCard and the other networks couldn't do it because incentives are bad, right? And if incentives are good because it allows, MasterCard and other networks to win business by compensating them for switching costs, then why is it bad for Visa to offer incentives to their existing customers to keep that business? And this is what every business does, right? And the funny part is there's other payment companies like they reference in this document, like PayPal, who are doing the same thing right now. Like if we go to PayPal's most recent earnings slides, right? Their transaction margin has been declining for, the past couple of years. And I've talked about this in a previous video about PayPal. Do you know why that's declining? It's declining because they're offering incentives to people to keep business because they don't want to lose the business. And so they're reducing prices. This is something I've talked about before about when people ask me why I don't like PayPal or why I don't like a Fiserv as an investment, because these are commodity companies that offer software to just be a middleman for payments. Like PayPal is a true middleman for payments because they're not the payment rail. They're just a piece of software on top that has a nice UI that you log into and then initiate a payment through the actual payment rail, which is Visa or MasterCard or whatever. So when I see this right here, what I see is that PayPal is having constant pressure to reduce prices to keep their business because their business has no moat. Now, the difference with Visa is they actually do have a moat, but they're still offering incentives to their clients to be able to keep that business and have the transactions running through their network. And the idea is that the incentives are good enough to where people are making business decisions to say, you know what? I don't want to go to other networks. I don't want to enable no other networks. I'm happy with what you guys are providing me. How is that wrong if you're saying that now it's a bad thing that MasterCard and the other networks can't do the same thing? And you're not calling out PayPal for doing exactly that in their own business. Like, this is insane. And I just highlighted this because it made me laugh. Visa has, quote, dominance on the front of cards. So in other words, Visa's built a great business and a great brand that people want to use and have associated with their debit cards. Awesome. I don't know how that's bad. And so again, they kind of talk about debit networks and how they can compete. And they say to compete effectively, however, a debit network also needs sufficient scale on both the issuer and merchant sides of the debit market. This feedback loop is known as network effects. And I mean, we know this, right? We talk about this as we talk about economic moats for companies. Having that network effect is very strong. And they say Visa has said building scale on both sides of the market can be a Herculean task. And I think they say this almost like a negative, like, oh, look, Visa knows that it's hard to compete with them. Well, yeah, that's their whole business. That is the task of anyone trying to compete with Visa. It's not about, oh, look, I can save you 25 basis points on a debit transaction. It's you have to have all the scale and all the merchants and issuers that we have in order to make it even an interesting discussion. And so that's part of the challenge I have with this is that we look at, these stupid charts like this and we say, oh, look, these are cheaper, they're better. But they're only better in that one very small instance of the chain. What you're getting with Visa or MasterCard even is something much bigger. You're getting a debit business, you're getting a credit business, you're getting analytics, you're getting the best fraud tools, you're getting all these things that also play a part in adding value to your business. So you can't just look at a stupid number in a chart and say, oh, this is anti-competitive because this is 25 basis points higher than this. And so as we continue on, they start talking about, contracts, and that's an ongoing theme in this document. They say that Visa's contracts with merchants and acquirers lock up volume, depriving rivals of scale and limiting routing choices artificially. Now, artificially is probably debatable, I think, but when we talk about contracts, right, 'cause this is a recurring theme, this is, at least in my experience, a pretty normal thing, right? You have a contract with a provider, and I've worked on contracts in my career, and yeah, you talk about things like exclusivity, because that's one of the things that they talked about here. Exclusivity was a pretty normal thing. We had plenty of contracts where it's like, hey, look, we're using this provider for bill payments, right? And they always had an exclusivity clause. And part of it was, hey, we're going to put this clause in there. We're going to give you a discount to keep us as your only bill pay provider. Okay, for us as a business at the time, we're like, yeah, you know what? We have no plans to use anybody else. So cool, put it in there. We'll take the discount. Sounds good. And then one year when we renegotiated it, we actually had a strategy to kind of move away from them and try some other things, right? So we negotiated hard to get that exclusivity clause out of there. And yeah, we had to pay a little more, right? But that was an actual real example that I was involved in. And I can't imagine that it's not, a pretty normal thing anywhere you go. So this idea that an exclusivity clause is anti-competitive, it's extremely normal, right? Just look at marketing anywhere that you go. How many times do you see, hey, business X is the exclusive provider of Y to the San Antonio Spurs, right? Or, Visa, the only card at the Olympics, right? How much did Visa have to pay the Olympics to be the only card, right? That comes out of their marketing spend. Well, that's very similar to saying, hey, let's have a contract where I'm going to be your provider. If I'm your sole provider, then I'll give you a discount and I'll put all my resources towards helping you be successful. What's wrong with that? That's normal business. You see why I'm so frustrated? I can't even talk. And just to kind of hammer this home, right? you don't have to have exclusivity. You can choose to pay more as a business, right? Like if you're like, you know what? I don't want to be beholden to Visa for the length of this contract. I'm not going to take the exclusivity discount. Cool. That's a decision you can make, right? These are all business decisions. You don't have to choose one or the other. Most of the time, people are choosing to say, yes, I'm fine with exclusivity because I don't have a problem with it. So, I just... Oh, it's terrible. Drives me nuts. So here's another one that kind of cracked me up a little bit. Merchants feel they must accept Visa or they will lose a substantial number of sales and consumers. Because of the large number of consumers using Visa-branded cards, nearly all merchants must accept Visa, which in turn requires nearly all merchants to route at least the non-contestable transactions to Visa instead of the often less costly back-of-card networks. Okay. At the end of the day, you have to make a choice, right? You're a merchant, right? You're trying to sell stuff, and if this cost, the extra 25 basis points of cost on your debit transaction, if that's a problem for you, don't take Visa, don't take cards. You don't have to. People can only pay with cash. There are plenty of businesses out there that only take cash. Are you kidding? I was just at my daughter's volleyball game last night. I went to the concession stand. I really wanted nachos, and it said cash only. And you know what? I didn't have any cash on me. So what did I do? I walked my little happy butt back to the stands, and I watched the game. There's nothing I could do. They made a choice. They didn't want to accept cards. They're taking cash only, and fine. It's a market. It's a free market. This is what free market means, right? And you can say, well, it's not fair because everybody has Visa cards. Okay, well, if everybody has Visa cards and you're a merchant who wants to sell to everybody with cards, then maybe you should pay the extra 25 basis points if it's worth that much to you. I don't know what else to say. Like, this is insane, man. It's insane where we're just like, you know what? This company is making too much money. They have, what did they call it? The outsized profit margins. This company's making too much money, so it's not fair for everyone else. It's fair. You don't have to take cards. Just take cash. If that impacts your business too much, then pay the 25 basis points. You have a choice. Okay, so just real quick, let's wrap up talking about FinTech a little bit. So a lot of what this is based on is they say a FinTech debit network can facilitate consumer to merchant payments by providing end-to-end functionality equivalent to debit card networks. Now, that is something that I disagree with. I think in some cases, the answer is yes, but I think in a few of the cases that they show, it's just simply not true, and we'll get into that. So they say alternative debit networks can complete this final transfer of funds using money transfer services available to banks, such as the Automated Clearinghouse, ACH, or real-time payment networks, which are lower-cost alternatives to Visa's debit offering. So here's where I have a little bit of a disagreement, right? So ACH is not the same as debit, and I think everyone knows that, right? ACH takes 2-3 days. You don't get real-time verification of funds on the merchant side. On the consumer side, your money isn't taken out of your balance immediately. That to me is not equivalent. That is a, worse offering than debit. So it's different. It shouldn't cost the same because ACH is not as fast and not as quick and you don't get as many benefits. So that's pretty simple. Real-time payment, RTP, is what I talked about in my Walmart video. That is more similar, right? Because it is a true kind of instant movement of funds. But again, the difference is that with RTP, there's no dispute processes or dispute rules within the network. It's a credit-only push that is final whenever it's completed, right? So is that equivalent? Well, it might be better for merchants, but it's not equivalent for the consumer. So that's where I think, words matter, right? Like we try to frame this like, oh, look, end-to-end functionality equivalent to debit card networks, but it's literally not equivalent. And they don't call that out at all. So, at the end of the day, if you want to be critical of Visa being a behemoth and using their power to continue holding on to their business, fine. I don't think they're doing it in a way that's like illegal or causing harm to consumers. If anything, if interchange is dropping because of Durbin, then hopefully that is passed on to consumers, which it's not, right? So, and then they kind of talk more about Visa's mindset here, which says Visa's internal documents make clear that Visa fears a world in which alternative debit networks mature and potentially take hold if fintechs choose to pursue their network ambitions. So in other words, Visa fears a world where they're disrupted and don't need Visa anymore. Okay, welcome to every single business leader in the world thinking about the future of their own business. right? Like, who wouldn't be thinking about that, worried about that? That's the whole point. So they go on to talk about how, Visa's network is massive and their incremental cost of each additional transaction on the Visa network is, quote, approximately zero. As Visa's former CFO put it, the incremental transaction comes with little incremental cost, unquote. Moreover, Visa bears no financial risk for fraud. Now, while this is true, this is something I talked about in my Visa video. It's one of the great things about their business is that they don't take the credit risk of the cards on their network, right? The issuing banks take that risk, which in theory is why the issuing banks get most of the interchange, right? They're taking the risk. But what I kind of have an issue with, it says Visa bears no financial risk for fraud. They don't bear the direct risk because the bank is taking that on. However, Visa's network and their fraud rules and their fraud analytics and their fraud tools absolutely help their issuers in terms of mitigating fraud on the network. So while they may not directly have any, risk for fraud on a transaction level, if they're not performing those other services well for their issuers, then their issuers are going to switch to another provider, right? Those are the type of things that would actually make a bank switch from Visa to MasterCard. Maybe if they're like, oh, hey, I've been working with Visa, their fraud tools suck, and we're taking a bunch of fraud, I'm going to look at MasterCard. Well, that's exactly how that would happen. So while they don't have a direct financial risk at the transaction level, they do still need to provide the type of tools and data and analytics and things for their customers, clients, banks to be able to mitigate fraud, or even on the merchant level, right? Because they have relationships on both sides. So again, a little misleading, not really true. Like, while it's technically true, it doesn't take into account how these services actually are used and evaluated by their customers. And to talk about the contract thing, they say, describing one proposed credit and debit routing contract with a different large merchant, a Visa employee wrote, "We continue to believe that we made a very strong offer that they cannot replicate with our competitors. While they could recover some but not all of the value they receive from us for the debit routing, they will lose all credit value. Walking away would not be a commercially reasonable decision for them, as Visa recognizes PIN network competitors do not have credit businesses to raid to buy debit routing." So they made a great offer that had a lot of value, and the customer said yes. This is why I'm like struggling. I'm just like, where does it say that the debit PIN networks need to be able to compete? If they want to compete, they should create a credit business to try to compete with Visa. Like, I don't know what you want me to say. I mean, this is kind of like all the big tech stuff, and I know the DOJ is going over against big tech as well. But, if Microsoft is, having a cloud business, and then they have Teams, and then they have all these other things, and that bundle has the value for you that you want, then cool. Like, you're making the decision based on the total amount of value that you're getting. I don't understand why we say it's anti-competitive because you can't choose one little crappy PIN debit network that's 25 basis points cheaper and lose out on all the other value you get for your business. Like, at the end of the day, these are business decisions that people are making based on the total value, not just one little small tree in a big forest. Like, it's just ridiculous. So yeah, and then they talk about, again here, Visa has nearly 1,000 issuing contracts that contain significant volume incentives, which strongly deter the issuer putting more debit networks on the back of the card. So are incentives bad again? Because remember, they were initially bad, and then they said, well, Durbin made it to where MasterCard couldn't do the same incentives, and that's not fair. But now they're saying that these incentives are bad again. Like, this is exactly what I mean. This is ridiculous. It's like, either incentives are bad or they're not. And if you want to argue one way or another, I'm fine with that, but let's at least keep it to where it's the same. Then they talk about Visa's response to the Durbin Amendment. They said Visa feared that competition from PIN networks post-Durbin would erode its monopoly share of debit. So again, to me, this is strategy, right? At the end of the day, there's a regulation that comes through. It's going to impact your business. It's going to say, you know what, you need to have more than one debit network on the back of the card or whatever it is. Then, yeah, you take that information and you formulate a strategy as a business of how you're going to kind of navigate it, right? That's normal course of business stuff to me. And here they say, in response to this new regulatory landscape, Visa has engaged in a relentless strategy of locking up the entities that control routing decisions and has now entered de facto exclusive routing contracts with over 180 of its largest merchants and acquirers. Visa's merchant and acquirer contracts cover over 75% of Visa's debit volume and results in the foreclosure of at least 45% of total U.S. debit volume. This denies competitors the scale necessary to compete effectively effectively because issuers have a lower incentive to add networks to the debit cards they issue if merchants predominantly route to Visa. So the government created something with Durbin that caused these companies to act, basically, to say, okay, if this is the new world that we're living in, how do we succeed in this world? And so they went to their merchants and they basically gave them incentive-laced contracts to keep their business, to keep them as the number one network. So, I just really struggle with this in terms of what do we expect Visa to do, right? You're going to pass laws. Do we expect them to just be like, oh, okay, sure, we're not going to change or adapt or do anything. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Come on, this is dumb. So in terms of kind of competitive mode, it says rival networks cannot grow their networks to sufficient scale or improve their network's features. They're caught in a vicious cycle as they lack enough usage and acceptance on either side of the market to effectively compete with Visa. Now, here's where I disagree, right? They can. They can do that work to build their network to be more attractive. They can go out there with loss leaders and try to get business, to try to get that scale, but that costs money. Right? That costs money, it takes time, it takes effort, and it means that they probably won't be able to be as cheap as they are today because they would have to actually invest in doing all that to get to that scale. And that to me is the biggest part of this. It's like, look, you're judging Visa based on a 25 basis point number that some PIN debit network can do. And yet you're saying, on the other hand, well, that network doesn't have the scale and they can't grow the scale. Well, maybe that's why they're cheaper. Right? Because you're not getting as much. So, it's not apples to apples, and we need to stop comparing it that way. And they even talk about it more here. A lack of scale also inhibits smaller networks from offering fraud protections equivalent or better than the market leaders because networks need sufficient transaction data to have acceptably robust fraud detection. Visa claims internally that absent sufficient transaction data, PIN networks are unable to match Visa's speed and accuracy at identifying fraud. Visa just sees more, and by its own recognition, continues to win despite PIN networks generally offering lower prices. There you go, right? They don't offer as much as Visa. Visa is giving you better fraud detection, and they've done it through economies of scale over time, and that's part of the value you're getting as a merchant. That's part of the value you're getting as an issuer. And so saying, well, it's not fair, the PIN networks don't have as much volume, so they can't do that. Okay, that sucks for you. That's why you're cheaper, because you don't offer as much. So you're trying to compete on price. And now we're saying, well, it's not fair because you don't have as much data, because you don't have as much business. And everyone in the chain is saying, you know what? I would rather pay a little bit more because I'm getting more with Visa. That's how the market works. All right, we're getting close to the end here. Now, they're talking about Visa's philosophy with new entrants like companies like FinTech, PayPal, Apple Pay, Cash App. And I thought this was an interesting inclusion where they say Visa's philosophy towards preserving its monopoly from attacks by new competitors can be boiled down to the words of its former CFO. Everyone is a friend and partner. Nobody is a competitor. As Visa's former CFO went to say, the only issue is to figure out how to make it worth their while to partner with us. And so far, we've managed to do that, whether it's with wallets, whether it's with large tech companies, or whether it's with large merchants. And as long as we keep doing that and keep our network valuable for everyone, things should be fine. The strategy has worked. I honestly am surprised that they put this in here because, in my opinion, this is like the greatest quote you could have put in there. They're basically saying, look, as long as our network has more value than disrupting our network has, we're good. And you know what? They're right. Like, who's to say that disrupting Visa is going to be good for consumers or good for merchants, right? If there was a business case to be had there, then someone would have done it. Right? This is the whole point, is that the whole infrastructure that you would have to build to truly disrupt Visa would be so much that the price per transaction would arguably be higher than it is today. Like, people are comparing it to where you say, well, PayPal is trying to offer it for free. Yeah, because they don't have the network. They're not offering the same functionality that you would get today. And that's the point. If they took the steps to offer you the same features, the price would probably be a lot more. So if we continue on, they talk about PayPal a little bit more. ACH transactions from PayPal's wallet included many of the same features as debit, such as fraud detection, fund guarantees, and the ability to dispute a transaction. Visa wanted to discourage staged digital wallets such as PayPal because it viewed them as an increased disintermediation risk for issuers in Visa, which came with a cannibalization risk. A Visa executive viewed having a commercial relationship with a company supporting a staged wallet model as a line that must never be crossed. And this is an important point, right? Like, what they're saying here is when it comes to payments, it's kind of this weird ecosystem where, there's a lot of interconnectivity between companies and between kind of, these companies that sit on top like PayPal and then the actual kind of payment rails like Visa. And, here what they're saying is, look, there's a line that we shouldn't cross. If PayPal wants to facilitate card transactions and have Visa cards as being part of that, then cool, let's do that. But if they want to be their own bank, but then not use the card networks to facilitate transactions, then that's something different that we probably shouldn't be a part of, because that's in direct competition with our business. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's nothing that says that a business has to basically allow another business to disrupt them and partner with them to do that. Like, it's ridiculous. And they say here that Visa had an ace card in its negotiations with PayPal. Even with PayPal's new model encouraging customers to pay directly with their bank accounts, a substantial number of its customers had continued to make payments through PayPal using their Visa-branded debit cards. To squash PayPal's use of ACH and the staged digital wallet model, Visa used the threat of exorbitant wallet fees and high rack rates on these Visa transactions to induce PayPal to enter into a new expansive routing contract. PayPal risked losing customers who used Visa on its platform if it told them they could no longer use their Visa-branded cards, and so it had little choice but to take the deal. So what they're saying here is that more of their customers wanted to pay with Visa debit cards than wanted to pay directly from their bank accounts. And PayPal wanted to do both, and Visa said, look, if you're going to do that, we're going to charge you more because that's in direct competition with our own business. And how I look at this is PayPal made a business decision. They could have easily said, you know what, we're not going to do Visa debit anymore. We're focused on allowing people to pay with their bank accounts, and that's our model, and that's what we're going to do. Except their consumers didn't want it. And that's the point. If they did it, they would have lost a lot of their own users, and they didn't want to lose their users, so they worked with Visa. To me, that's not a monopoly. To me, that is a good product that people want to use. It's not Visa's fault that PayPal recognized that if they stopped allowing Visa debit transactions, that they would probably lose a lot of their own users. It just means that people wanted to use Visa debit. They wanted to use their debit card and not PayPal's pay by bank thing. I mean, that is market forces at work. All right, so here's kind of where I'll wrap up in terms of the document. They say, absent Visa's exclusionary and anti-competitive contracts with merchants, acquirers, and issuers, and other industry participants, Visa's back-of-card competitors would have the chance to gain the scale needed to compete effectively with Visa and offer banks and merchants real choices. Absent Visa's exclusionary and anti-competitive contracts with potential FinTech rivals, those would-be competitors would have greater incentive to innovate and compete more directly with Visa, and Visa would have more incentive to respond, offering consumers and businesses new choices and better features. Thus, absent Visa's anti-competitive and exclusionary conduct, competition from current and potential rivals would increase competition and likely lead to lower fees, better service, or greater innovation. Now, the first part of this that I'm going to challenge is greater innovation. What does that mean? Like, to me, those are nothing words. Those are just words that people throw out to sound good and sound smart. Greater innovation in terms of what? Like, what aspects of our payment system today are not working, right? What pain points do people have in terms of payment? And remember, we're talking about debit payments. So just paying and buying something retail, either online or in the store, right? What pain points are people having that require greater innovation? Because a greater innovation by itself doesn't mean anything. It's greater innovation in the pursuit of what? And they don't say because they don't know. Now, the other parts here, a better service, it's kind of along the same points of line. Better service in terms of what? What parts of the service do people not like today? Now, when they talk about likely lead to lower fees, now this is really the root of the matter, right? Where you're saying these debit companies can't compete on fees because they don't have the scale that Visa has. And these contracts are keeping people locked in. And so if we're really talking about lower fees, my question would be this. If at this point you're paying 80 basis points or a little under 80 basis points for a debit transaction. And if the potential opportunity, right, of lower fees is 25 basis points or whatever these are lower than Visa's are, what is the whole kind of thing worth? Because how I view this whole lower fee thing and competition thing is you can only grade fees based on the total suite of things that you're getting, right? So if people want to compete with Visa and MasterCard, what I always say is, hey, great. All you got to do is go create a global system that allows you to pay in any currency, has dispute rules and all these things kind of built in, works 24/7, 365. Tell me how much that costs and then what you need to be able to make on every transaction after that once you're done, right? And the reality is that people don't want to do that because it's such a huge undertaking. But my issue is that's exactly what Visa and MasterCard did already. And that's why they have the economic moat that they do. I really struggle with this where it's like, they're anti-competitive and exclusionary contract practices. In my experience, those are basically doing business. And I think if you look across any industry, you're going to have that. Like, does Walmart have, exclusivity built into their contracts with their distributors, with their providers, right? The people who, come in and say, hey, look, I don't know, Pepsi, and I want you to put this stuff front of, aisle or whatever. And I want to be the exclusive, aisle snack, or I'm just making up stuff. Clearly, I don't work in this area. I'm guessing they have exclusivity built into their contracts, right? Because look, here's how contracts work. Yes, you may have exclusivity built into the contract, but it's only for the duration of the contract, right? Where you say, you know what, I am going to take these incentives and I'll make you the exclusive whatever because it's worth it to me. And when this contract is up in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever the time frame is, then I'm going to do an RFP process, which is a request for proposal. And this is very normal, right? Every company does it. And that's basically me doing my due diligence that whenever our contract is up, that I'm going to reevaluate the providers and see who has the best combination of cost to features to value for my business. And I may go into that process knowing, you know what, I really love working with Visa. They've been a great partner and I want to continue that. But my company requires me to go through this due diligence process. I mean, I did that so many times in my own job. So it's not like it's anti-competitive because those contracts are going to be up at some point and have to be renewed. And there has to be requests for proposals and all that stuff during that process. So, what I really struggle with this whole thing is I feel like these type of documents and articles and issues are what you get when you have, politicians or appointed kind of officials who represent politicians or a political party who have very little to no experience in actual business, and they make judgments on businesses. It drives me insane. So I struggle for a lot of reasons when they say that Visa is monopolizing debit markets. Number one, MasterCard's there as well. So how can Visa be a monopoly when MasterCard's right there? And they're actually cheaper than MasterCard and Discover on average. So if this is really about the PIN debit networks not being able to compete and assuming that merchants are going to give lower prices if they could, I simply disagree. I don't think being able to isolate one little part of the chain and saying, hey, look, that's cheaper and not considering everything around it, to me, doesn't really make any sense. And at the end of the day, look, the Durbin Amendment already reduced debit interchange. And based on the studies, consumers got zero actual benefit from merchants in terms of reduced prices. So, if we want to go after anything, I think we need to say, okay, if we're going to do something like this and we're going to, pass legislation to force companies into competing in a certain way, then we should at least be running kind of the data and analytics afterward to prove that it actually had the intended consequences that we thought it would. Because I think what happens in these cases is you have politicians, you have appointed officials who go on these rants and try to, make a name for themselves and get their next promotion. And we never go back and actually look if the ideas they had and the reasons why they did stuff actually worked and actually helped consumers. Because I would argue that you can change payment rails, but I don't think consumers are going to get any benefit. I actually think it's going to be worse for consumers. And part of the reason why all these companies end up just partnering with Visa is because customers like Visa. They like using their cards. They know how to use their cards, and it works. And I think that alone should be something that we should consider a little bit more, as opposed to just looking at 25 basis points on a table and saying, oh, this is unfair. But that's just my thoughts on it. I know I have a very strong opinion on it. Curious to hear if you guys made it this far. Oh my goodness, thank you. This has got to be the longest, boringest video ever. But if you did, I appreciate it. I hope you got something out of it that had some value for you. If you have questions, let me know down in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. And I'm curious to hear what you think. What do you think about this whole kind of DOJ thing against Visa? Do you agree with me that it's all kind of nonsense and, political theater? Or do you really think there are some merits here that maybe I overlooked or didn't give enough credit to? I'm curious to hear. But anyway, if you guys want to see my original analysis on Visa when I added it to my portfolio, you can watch that by clicking this right here. Hope you guys have a great day out there. Financial independence is true freedom. So keep building and stacking wins, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.